about in terms of staple crops, I kind of see as a transitional strategy. So for me, it's not the end goal to be growing annual food for the rest of time, but as the forest is establishing, because it takes time, especially for like nut trees and other things, if you want to be getting like a balanced diet from a food forest, then yeah, this is a kind of strategy in the meantime. So obviously some food groups like greens, they're really easy. You can plant a lot of perennial greens. You can allow a lot of wild greens into your system. And then you're already going to have that like in the first year. So kind of that aspect of it is easy. And then over time, you're going to have like fruits, nuts, like different roots and herbs and things, which are all going to be important. But kind of as those things are establishing, what I've seen is, yeah, there's kind of space in the system and then space in the kind of nutrition that I'm getting from the garden, where it's important to have these staple crops. And yeah, I think it's also kind of important if we're looking at the general situation at the moment, you know, maybe we have time where we can think long term about what we're going to get from our garden, but maybe in the short term also we're going to have like an ever nearing collapse of the food systems that we have around us, like we've already seen with like a lot of climate chaos. Weather patterns are changing. It's very hard for perennial crops to adapt immediately. It's hard for the agro-industrial food system to respond to that. A lot of the like kind of food, the broken supply chains have been meaning that yeah, a lot of people have been left without food. A lot of the things with COVID, there's been a lot of people who are suddenly relying on food banks. So kind of in this situation, I think it's really important to think about to start planning basically for how would we get in a short term like a lot of nutrition from land, and how could we do it in a way that doesn't mimic these big agricultural systems that are causing so much damage. So yeah, if we look at the kind of the main crops which are being grown at the moment, there's a lot of things that are based on grains. So there are a lot of things that need, oh, Maria, can you mute yourself? Um, yeah, so kind of thinking about alternative patterns that aren't relying on having a huge amount of land, a huge amount of machinery, processing, chemicals. So yeah, what I want to look at is a kind of a pattern of thinking about growing stable crops. And again, I'm gonna just kind of, in terms of it as a pattern, like going from the pattern to the details, just kind of looking at some of the characteristics and then some examples, but also kind of look at kind of 5 main things you could grow. But at the same time, yeah, to not kind of mimic that pattern of the industrial system where we're growing and eating a very small amount of food groups. This is a kind of like a basis, like a backbone to get started with. And then from there, you obviously have like a lot of diversity of other crops as well that you're growing, and wild foods and things that you're foraging depending on what you have access to. So this is a kind of like a starting point rather than encouraging you to just like have 5 things that you're based on. So yeah, what I was looking at was there's a book by a woman called Carol Depp, which is called The Resilient Gardener, Food Production for Self-Reliance in Uncertain Times. And yeah, she's pretty interesting. Her background was she was a Harvard professor in biology. So she did a lot of work looking at like crop breeding, and yeah, working kind of on that side of the plants. But she was also a gardener, so she did a lot of work kind of experimenting with her garden. She also kind of looked at how as she was getting older, she had like certain food allergies, she was gluten intolerant, the kind of the main foods that were being grown didn't work for her. And she was also trying to think of like an easier way that she could create a kind of stable food growing system. So basically what she has in the book is kind of like 5 staple crops, and she kind of gives this pattern of like what we would want to look at. So, you know, as I said before, in the kind of industrial food system, we've got all these things like wheat, soya, rice, all things that need to be grown usually on a large scale and harvested with machines, or if you harvest it by hand, it's very labor intensive. So if you think about like the amount of wheat that we consume, that we waste, if we were harvesting that by growing that and harvesting that by hand, it would be like a really intense amount of energy. So that's something I certainly don't want to do in my place, to start like growing those grains. And then from a health point of view as well, they're all things that are like quite hard for our bodies to digest. So basically she's looking at these foods, and she's giving the characteristics of them being easy to grow on a small scale, being easy to harvest, and like prepare for storage or for eating without a lot of processing or machinery, to be easy to store over a long time. So like obviously we've been talking about things like fermentation and canning and stuff, but on like a large scale, you don't want to have to be preserving all of your food like that. So things that you can kind of have in some kind of cool, dark storage that will last for a long time. So she's from North America, so she's got like a similar pattern in the kind of temperate climate of like growing a lot of things in a summer season and then storing them over the winter. And then also, you know, foods that are enjoyable to eat. So like things that you could eat regularly and that you could prepare in a lot of different ways. Because obviously, yeah, there's some crops that maybe they're going to be like a super nutrient crop, but there may be going to be something like rutabaga that you're not really going to want to eat every day, or like artichokes, the Jerusalem artichokes, you might not be able to have that as like a staple crop and keep your digestion and your friends around. So yeah, basically what she kind of identified that would fit that pattern for her based on like her kind of climate, her what she enjoyed eating and what she could eat, were the 5 of potatoes, beans, pumpkins, corn, and eggs. And what we've been doing is adapted that pattern. So obviously that's like not a vegan pattern. We've adapted that for like, yeah, firstly to be vegan, and then also to kind of meet our climate and our needs. So yeah, in her book, she kind of goes into a lot of detail about all those different crops, and for each one, she's growing like a lot of different varieties. So she's talking about, you know, growing like 8 or 10 different kinds of potatoes that are for different uses, that harvest at slightly different times. The same with beans. And she's thinking very carefully, you know, about how they would fit into that pattern. So for example, beans, you know, you've got them as like a high protein food. And if you're thinking about, you know, making sensible use of space, if any one of you have grown chickpeas, you'll know that like chickpeas are lovely. You can eat them raw, you can cook them, but you get a really low yield for the amount of space and energy it takes up. Whereas if you've got pole beans, you might have to put some more work in to make a structure, or you might plant them up a tree, but you're going to get a much higher yield for like the energy that you put into growing them. So all the time she's trying to like think about, you know, like what is the kind of the best thing. So if you're looking at these kind of legumes, in general, beans are going to be one that are like very easy to grow and to process, whereas things like chickpeas, you're going to get a very low yield, and things like lentils, again, you're going to get quite a low yield and they're quite fiddly to process. So yeah, that's kind of the main pattern. And then, you know, in terms of adapting this pattern, as always, it's better to look at the overview. So to look at those characteristics of like what makes a good staple crop, and then think about how you would adapt that for your own system. So you'd want to look at, first of all, the climate. So, you know, what kind of crops can you grow? How long is your growing season? What zone are you in, to see if those things are appropriate. Also to look at the space. So, you know, thinking about, you know, what are your limiting factors? Do you have enough space? Some of these things obviously are going to need quite a lot. So, okay, with beans, you can use the vertical space. You can stack them with other things. You can, you know, grow them up the trees in your forest garden, for example, when they're small, or up the sticks that are supporting maybe like soft fruit or climbers or something while those are still young. But other things, maybe like pumpkins, they're going to take up more space. Maybe you can put them in between things that haven't started to grow up yet once you've got your trees and things in place. So you want to think about the space and, like, you know, what needs a lot of space and what you can kind of stack into what you've already got. Also your water budget, because obviously these are annual crops. They're going to give like a high calorific output. They're going to give you, you know, a lot of food, but at the same time, they've got shallow roots. They're not like all these amazing perennials. So you're going to have to think about the water budget, like how much can you actually grow? What is your water budget? How could you compare it or combine it? Maybe if you're already growing trees, to grow them between your trees. So you're watering the trees, you're watering the vegetables. And then to think also about fertility inputs. So again, as annuals, they're going to need much more fertility than, you know, a tree over time. So you're going to need to think about, you know, are you making compost, liquid fertilizers? Have you got like nitrogen fixing crops that you can chop and drop? Have you got other organic matter that you can use and break down around these crops? So then again, you need to think about that kind of budget. You know, how much of these things could you actually grow with the resources that you have around you? So yeah, we've adapted this, and I'm still like experimenting with it. But what we found is we've already been growing potatoes, but we've actually started growing the last couple of years sweet potatoes, which we like more. So like in terms of nutrition, they've got like a similar amount of like protein, of carbohydrates, but they've got much higher amounts of like vitamin A, vitamin C, calcium. They've got like a lower GI. So that means that you don't get this like big sugar spike that you get with a lot of kind of like these like white crops. So like white potatoes, white rice, things like that, which kind of like make your blood sugar go up and down and can be really unhealthy. They're also a different family. So like the normal white potatoes, they're from the nightshade family, the Solanaceae family, which can actually be a little bit poisonous, and they can be kind of inflammatory. Whereas sweet potatoes, they're from the Convolvaceae family. So that's like the morning glory family. I'm going to show some pictures at the end. So yeah, they're a different family. And so they've got all these nutritional benefits. You can eat not only the tuber, you can eat the leaves. The leaves are really delicious. They're really nutritious. So as it's growing, it's making this like beautiful carpet of leaves. It's like heart-shaped leaves and growing everywhere. It's a really nice ground cover between your trees. So like taking up sunny spaces and clearings in your garden. So yeah, you can eat the leaves, you can eat the tubers. And also compared to normal potatoes, what we found is that they keep a lot better. So we found even in kind of like containers of like slightly moist sand, the potatoes can still start like shooting quite early and start getting kind of wrinkly. So whereas the sweet potatoes, they keep really well. Like, so we like harvested them in the autumn, and here I got one here. You can see like they're still like looking really fresh. They're really firm, and I haven't stored them in anything. They're just in a box in a cool space. So yeah, I'm pretty proud of these potatoes. I even had some bigger ones. Yeah. And what you can see as well is like we had some kind of help from some small creatures. So you can see here, like a mouse or a mole rat had a little nibble on it. But what's really nice is you can see it's just healed up. So rather than going moldy or getting like soft, it's kind of like made this like skin and healed over that place. So the whole potato is actually really strong. And then when I come to prepare it, I can just like remove that little part. So yeah, they're really, really nice crop. And, you know, looking at all the characteristics of being easy to grow, easy to process, being easy to store. Obviously, you can cook them in a lot of ways, and yeah, they're just really delicious. And also, yeah, there's something like, especially in Bulgaria, they're really expensive. So we always like gift a portion of what we grow to different people. And it's really nice to be able to gift something that's like kind of unusual, and that has like that kind of like novelty or like interest value to people. I think I'm also running a bit out of time, but I'll just go through the other ones. So again, yeah, beans is another one we've been growing a lot of. And like I said, yeah, you've got a much higher yield if you're growing beans than some of the other legumes. Again, you can look at growing different kinds of beans. So you can spread your harvest, that you can start off with broad beans, which you can grow in the autumn, which can grow over the winter because they survive to about -15. Yeah, the sweet potato leaves are edible. Yeah. You just have to remember to not eat too many of the sweet potato leaves if you want to get good tubers, because obviously if you defoliate it, that's how it's getting its energy to feed the tubers. But what you can also do is have like two patches. You can have like a patch more for leaves, or like the edge of your patch for leaves, and another place where you're taking some, where you're focusing more on the tubers, or just like walk around and like take a few leaves here and there, and you're not gonna disturb your plants. Yeah, and they seem to have been really resistant to any diseases. We haven't had any problems. And another thing actually I forgot to mention is obviously with potatoes, you've got to earth them up because of the pattern of how they grow. You've got like the first potatoes which are growing here, and then you've got to earth up the stems so that the next potatoes grow a higher position up the stem. But because the sweet potatoes have a different pattern, they're basically just like growing down like this into the ground, and then the vines are growing around to get more sun. But they're always just growing in one position. So you don't need to earth them up. You don't need to weed them because they've created their own ground cover. And they're also really good at breaking up the soil. So we've got like a heavy clay soil. And because of their shape, like you can imagine, they grow like in this position. They grow like hanging down, like under the ground like that. So like fingers pushed into the ground. So they're like amazing at breaking up the soil. So yeah, they're really powerful, and you can see they're just like big crazy potatoes. But yeah, tasty torpedoes. So yeah, that's the sweet potatoes. And if I've got time at the end, I'll just show some pictures about how I propagated them, because yeah, like if you're in, probably Marta's got like an easier job because she's got a longer season there in Texas. And maybe in England, it's going to be harder because there's a shorter season and we're somewhere like in the middle. But they do need a long season. So yeah, there's kind of way of getting them started. Yeah, I'm going to show some pictures in the end. Maybe I'll go a little bit into the break, but yeah, I'll try and get to that. So yeah, just to finish up the other things, kind of like the beans. Yeah, what we've been doing is growing different kinds of beans. So like growing runner beans, broad beans, French beans, climbing beans. We've like made constructions. So I've got like constructions that are for like loganberries and other things, but while there's space on them, you can put beans up them. And then obviously you've got like the fresh beans you can eat. You've got dried beans. So we grew about like, I guess we've got 15 kilos of dried beans this year. And we've got, again, a lot of different varieties. And then obviously, once you start to build up like a seed bank, I want to have like a lot of different kinds, and then it's possible to share them with other people in the community, and to know that if there's a need to grow like a lot of food to help people locally, that I've got like that big bank of seeds that I can immediately like put in the ground, and I know like a lot of food is going to come up. yeah, we're also growing pumpkins. They're another thing that again need water and fertility and space, but they grow a lot of food. And that again is a good vitamin rich, carb rich, also got some good protein in it. Corn is one of the ones that she talks about, which again is like, okay, it's not really a grain, but yeah, it's something that she talks about a lot, like grinding and using instead of like wheat for making like breads and different things. I've tried growing some corn. It's like, I like kind of raw sweet corn in terms of growing a lot of corn for grain. I'm not really sure. It's not, I don't know. It's, yeah, maybe not like what I want to focus on so much, but yeah, we've been experimenting with some corn. And then, yeah, instead of the kind of the eggs, we've been looking at growing mushrooms. They're a way of growing like really fast protein. Again, you can like put them on different substrates. So if you've got different waste carbonous materials, that's a good way of like cycling that. So we've been growing oyster mushrooms. And maybe, yeah, like in terms of kind of getting your main nutrition, the thing that's kind of missing from that is like healthy fats. So like we're lucky here in Bulgaria that there's a lot of wild like walnut trees in kind of public places that's possible to wild harvest from while we're waiting for our nut trees to grow. Maria probably knows about this, but yeah, there's a tradition in Bulgaria of like planting a kind of alley of walnuts leading up to villages, and they were like a shared resource that people were welcome to collect for medicine, for food. So that's a real beautiful gift. But yeah, that's kind of, we've also experimented with growing like pumpkin seeds. But again, that's a lot of space. And when you grow a seed pumpkin, you get the ones without the shell. They're like naked green seeds inside, like the ones you buy. And that's one of the highest plant-based source of protein. But yeah, you have to grow a lot of pumpkins and the flesh of them is not really tasty. I tried preparing it in different ways. I tried fermenting it and it was kind of like not so exciting. So yeah, for now I think, yeah, nut trees are still like the amazing one for protein and for good fats. Okay, I'm 8 minutes over. Okay, so yeah, maybe that's enough to say with that. And it's, again, it's like a work in progress. So like this year we grew, I think, about 50 kilos of sweet potatoes, 20 kilos of potatoes, 100 kilos of pumpkins, and about 15 kilos of dried beans. And yeah, if you kind of look at all the things you need to survive, it's, you know, it's not necessarily everything that we need for 6 months, but it's kind of a start. And yeah, it means that we've got seeds, it means that we've kind of got some experience, and then yeah, like year by year we can grow on that, and then hopefully at some point it's going to meet us with the trees giving more, and yeah, we'll kind of have that stability and also have that knowledge and have that seed material to be able to share it with people around us locally, which is a really important thing for me, to like feel like the land we have, that we could use to help other people if needed, that people could come and use it to grow their own things, and that we have that like food and seeds that we can share with other people.
Sorry, Sophie, but you've taken all the break as well
I'm really
as, and
sorry.
now
Yeah,
it's Ainslie's time. We're ready to start. So
yeah, we started a bit late, but yeah, I've gone on a lot. So anyway, thanks for
So
that.
you can show the photos if you want. I don't mind you nibbling in some of my time.
Are you sure, Ainsley?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Let's go and show them quickly. Can I have permission to share my screen, Rakesh?
Okay, and do people want to take a break, or should we
if
just
anyone wants to take a break while I'm showing potato pictures, go for it. I'll just do this like quickly in the break. Maybe it's the best thing. yeah, so here you can see, can you see my screen okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Good.
Cool. Trying to move the, okay. So this is like, yeah, where we've got the potatoes planted in soil. So we've just like kept some potatoes from the previous season. We've got them like half buried in the damp soil, and then you can see they've started shooting. So you can see these little shoots coming off the tuber. Here you can see just how we've got them in this container, and they start giving off really like a big abundance of shoots just from 2 potatoes. And then what we've done is, once they've grown up, we've broken off the shoots. And here you can see after they've been sitting in water for a bit of time, they've rooted. And once they're rooted like that, they're ready to plant. So depending on the timing, like if you're already in frost-free times, you can plant them directly outside. But if you want to get a head start because you need to have the longest growing season, you can get them to this stage, and then you can put them in pots and keep them in a frost-free area till you've passed your last frost date, and then you can plant them out when they're already a bit bigger. So obviously, if you've got a long growing season, you don't need to bother with that. But if you have a shorter growing season, you might want to do that extra step. But otherwise, you can just break them off, root them, and plant them. So here I've got some like growing up. You can also see once they get really tall, you can just cut them in half, and then the top that you've broken off, you can again just root that. So you can keep making a fractal, just cutting off the top and rooting it, and then you end up with more and more. And this is what it looks like when it's covering the ground. So you can see it's got this flower that's like the morning glory flower, and it really makes this like beautiful carpet and just covers the whole ground. So we had like a huge area of this, and we had it like growing between a lot of trees and bushes, and really like protected the ground around them. So yeah, it's a really, really nice crop. And there you can see some of the tubers. You can see here some of them have been a bit chewed, so it was a really nice fair share for us. The mole rat had some, we had some, maybe the mice had some, but yeah, there was enough for everyone. Here we've got some of them, and here you can see there's 2 kinds. So there's this like orange kind we were growing, and then there's this purple kind, which is kind of, from our experience anyway, kind of smaller tubers, and it's a bit more kind of starchy. So I prefer the bigger one like roasted, and the smaller one is good in like soups because it kind of like thickens the soup. It's like really nice if you make like a miso soup and you put like some greens and some of these potatoes in. And there it is, yeah, roasted with some tahini sauce. So yeah, that's the basic kind of steps of just, yeah, growing, breaking off the shoots, rooting them, and then planting them.
Amazing. Yeah, there's also the white variety, which has a white inside as well, which is really sweet. Much,
Really?
much,
Haven't tried
much sweeter. Yeah. That's always one of my favorites.
But how can
Amazing.
it be any sweeter? I don't know. These become like caramel in the oven.
Cool.
Cool. Okay, sorry I've gone over so long, but thanks for listening.
Cool. So do we want to take a break, or should we just move straight into Ainslie's topic of permaculture? Permaculture ethos, is it? Is that right?
It's been many things. Initially, I was hoping to do something about key thinkers and then how they relate to permaculture, but gradually I decided that I didn't feel competent enough to do that, and instead I'm going to be presenting an interactive session. So my apologies that I'm not sticking to the brief.
Okay, all's good.
Now, does everyone want to go for a break, or shall we go straight into the session?
I think let's go straight.
Let's go for it. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Okay. Well, permaculture people. Philosophy. What does it mean? It stems from the Greek philo and Sophia, philo being love, Sophia being wisdom. Some people say it translates to the love of wisdom. One of the key figures you could mention is Socrates, and he had a method the Socratic method. And it was a way of being able to determine the presence of knowledge or the lack thereof. We're going to do an experiment to see whether or not we are able to determine what permaculture is through using the Socratic method. Now, I will need mics on for the exercise, and hopefully we will be able to come up with something together. There's some contention, as you may all know, about philosophy, permaculture rather, and what it means. So would anybody be willing to converse with me and see what permaculture is all about?
How many people do you need to?
Oh, just anybody whatsoever. You can say what you think permaculture is, and then I will go on to ask you some more questions about what you think permaculture is.
I think it would be nice if it wasn't me who did it, but if no one else steps up, I'm happy to.
Please help me out here. Somebody.
How much knowledge do we need to have?
Well, no, not much of anything whatsoever. Just tell me what you think permaculture is.
Why don't we do a few people so there's not so much pressure?
Yeah. Go ahead, everybody.
Sean, I see you want to come in as well, Ryan.
I'll help you, Maria.
Let's do it, guys. Sean, don't be shy now. I saw that.
I'm here.
I'm Ryan. Cool, let's do it. Nice.
Okay.
I'm basing it on a limb of understanding how nature actually works. That's my understanding, hence why I'm here, of how it works, not how I think it works or how I want it to work, but how does nature actually work? So that's my spin on it.
And what does everybody else think? Does anybody else have any other workable definitions that they'd like to offer up?
Well, I just want to think about the prefix perma, and that relating to time, permanence maybe, or something that is, I don't know, cyclical or open-ended.
Yeah. And anybody else?
I just have the ethics in my head, so I keep on thinking of people care, fair share, healthcare, but obviously it's not about that. It's about the origin of the word.
Oh, no, not necessarily. I mean, what does it mean? Does it mean anything in particular to you?
Just permaculture is just permaculture. Does it mean anything? We're not looking at origin of words. Just
no, we're not speaking about the word per se. We're not speaking about any strict definition. We're speaking about what it means to you. So some people would consider it to be a movement. Other people would consider it to be a design methodology. Some people think that it has something to do with spirituality. Others think that it is a combination of the above. Is there anything that strikes you? Like, what's the first thing you think about? Permaculture design, permaculture spirituality, permaculture a way of being able to regain power for the people?
I think, like what you're saying, it's everything off above. Like, but for me, it kind of starts with just observation and really trying to see what's working, what the land wants to do, and just that different approach to agriculture.
And I think it's really important that people have different understandings of what the term permaculture means, because it does show that it is something that is varied. There is no absolute definition. It relies upon relativity. And that's something that I kept on coming back to when I was doing some of this research. There was an article that I read, and it was saying that we ought not to have spirituality and permaculture mixed in together. That will bring fearful results. People will be frightened away. What if we see people barefoot walking around the farm and praising Gaia? Well, is that what we want? And then somebody else was saying, well, no, it should be a pure scientific pursuit. There should be no spirituality involved with it whatsoever. Now, I don't sit here or there. I am on the fence. I'm a fence sitter. I will let people decide what they think permaculture is. I think part of the empowerment of permaculture comes from being able to know that it is something that you yourself are involved with. You are becoming intimate with the term and also with the practice. The definition evolves with time.
Can I give my definition then?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
So my definition of permaculture is common sense in a world where sense is no longer common. That's my most, so it's, for me, it's a way of life.
Yeah.
It is how I live. It's about how I understand who I am, what my surroundings are, and how I interact with those surroundings in a way that feeds me and enriches my life, but also enriches everything else, enriches the world around us. So it is very much it's a philosophy which has a very clear, well-defined design system for bringing about richness to everything. And so by that definition, you can put spirituality into it, but itself, it may not necessarily be spiritual. But if you see the world through spiritual, I mean, for me, I guess it depends on how you define spirituality. So when we do our holistic life design, we try and get people to define spirituality for them, and everyone's got a slightly different approach, and that's fantastic. But for me, it's about something that is not me, something that is, part of this world, something that is in, maybe not even tangible, but something that is outside. So it's my relationship to something other than what I can perceive to be myself. So it's my relationship to everything, all other energetic bodies, humans, animals, wind, air, sun, bacteria, everything. So,
But Rakesh, do you see yourself in it or separate from it?
absolutely, totally part of it. Totally part of it, swimming within it, being completely, but it's recognizing that as a separate, as an entity, I have certain determination of myself and a perception of myself, but I am absolutely completely part of a bigger set of other entities that also have a similar self-determination, and we are all completely, totally interrelated. So the energy that I manifest affects the energy of others, and other things affect my energy. So we're not separate in any way. We cannot be separate.
No, it's a relationship. It serves you and you give it service. It's all about it's service. It serves you and you serve it. So you need to understand. I don't mean it's not it. You need to understand nature, but then it also understands you for what you need. So it will produce what you need. We just have to respect it.
Yeah. So permaculture encompasses spirituality, depending on how you see, how you define spirituality. If you define spirituality as some kind of a religious doctrine, then this is something totally different. That's not what I talk about. That's not what I mean.
Sorry, just as you were talking, Rakesh, I got the words that I had in my, because I was going to say it's a way of life. So thank you for articulating that so beautifully. But I think also what just came to mind is connection to source, and whatever that source may be for you, but it's just total connection to source, if that makes any sense, and to just everything. It's just truth. It's just total connection. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's permaculture for me.
Fabulous. Thank you, everybody, for contributing towards the exercise. And as we can see, there's a diverse range of answers, and there is supposedly no one correct answer to what the definition ought to be. And I think I wanted to do something similar with the ethics in and of themselves. And I think that when you take something like people care, what that means to the individual shifts depending upon which individual you're speaking about. And people care in what sense? Are we speaking about zone 00? Are we speaking about the sense, the self? Or are we speaking about something that exists beyond the self, another individual? Or are we extending that personhood to indeed other animals that live alongside us? Or maybe we might even have an animistic approach to the external world, and we consider the wind to perhaps be a person of sorts that has maybe a consciousness of its own. I don't entirely know how far animism goes with something like that, but it is curious what it is that we mean by people care, because if we do consider the, say, Earth to be conscious in some respect, if we consider it to be a person, or if we consider it, like James Lovelock, to be an organism, then maybe you could even consider the Earth to be something more like a person than like a dead piece of rock. Now, when it comes to people care, what's the first thing that comes to everybody's mind? Is there anything in particular that pops up for anybody? Is there any right way, perhaps, of doing people care?
For me, I mean, an important aspect, I think, of people care is like social justice, and that feels like it's sometimes missed out. But for me, that's what it's like pinning down is social justice, I guess. I mean, there's other aspects of people care, but like if it's missing that, for me, it's missing something really fundamental.
And I think you hit on a key point, and that is that permaculture in some respects can be intersectional. You look at something like people care, which is an ethic, and then that soon begins to relate to the designs which you are producing. Is the design catering to the needs of a specific set of individuals, or is this design catering towards a larger set of individuals? Is it accessible? Is it something that is benefiting the group as opposed to selfish individuals that have their vested interests, and so on and so forth? So yes, I do agree that it can be about social justice and whether or not we are adequately dealing with the social realm in a just fashion. Now, when it comes to something like earth care, something similar could be said about it. There are many different ways of interpreting it, and there are many different ways of putting it into practice. But perhaps we can move on from that and begin to speak about something else which I found in my research. So there was an article that I read, and it was saying that permaculture may well become a people science. And I was thinking to myself, is there anything contentious about this? Should we really want to consider permaculture to be a science? Some people are almost afraid of the term, and I was wondering whether there was any personal opinions about permaculture being involved with any. I was wondering if anybody was. Sorry, I'm just thinking about how to put it. When I was doing some research, I found an article that was speaking about permaculture and science, and one of the person that wrote it suggested that permaculture could become a people science, meaning that instead of permaculture being locked away in an ivory tower in some academic institute, it could be something that is worked upon by the individuals that are practicing it. That does make sense in terms of being able to maintain power within the population as opposed to concentrating that power within any given institution. That's one of the particular takes that you could have with something like that. But then I think it begins to add something else which is perhaps needed, and that is some sort of hard base of evidence that can be drawn upon in order to prove the efficacy of permaculture methods, whatever they happen to be, or techniques. Just as an experiment, would anybody like to offer up a way of working collectively as a permaculture community in order to provide some evidence for some of the practices which we are engaging with?
What do you mean exactly, Ainsley?
So So with the, sorry, I've lost my train of thought and I don't know quite where I'm going to go with this, but let me take a moment and think about what it is that I was trying to say.
Was it, I mean, I think I kind of understood it, Ainsley, as you were asking us how we could kind of collectively build some sort of evidence or proof that's going to convince people who maybe are less inclined to think of permaculture as a fact-based, way of growing things, for example. Obviously, it goes beyond growing things, it goes beyond that. But I think there's a perception it's kind of this like new age thing that doesn't really, I mean, some people have this, that isn't based on anything. It's like, oh, it's criticizing big agriculture and stuff like that, but it's offering this so-called solution, but it's, it's just kind of like not real science, quote unquote. Are you kind of asking if we can, for like
yeah, most definitely. And as I was saying, one of the articles that I was reading was suggesting that instead of simply detaching ourselves from the scientific community, perhaps we could construct a people science, a way of involving ourselves in research on the ground or in the field, so that we can keep a sort of grassroots identity whilst also dealing with some of the questions that people have about productivity. So sometimes people say, or they rally the claim at permaculture, that somehow it is not productive, that you walk into a permaculture garden and it's simply a mess, that there's no way of truly producing food here. And perhaps one of the ways of moving towards some sort of widespread acceptability is having some hard statistical evidence in order to prove the legitimacy of permaculture and some of its methods. And I was wondering whether anybody had any suggestions of how something like that would be constructed.
I think there are already some examples of it. Like maybe, the term citizen scientist is also like an interesting one in terms of like people not just looking for legitimacy in the kind of the world of official science, but also, using certain methods to like empower ourselves as citizens, also to kind of record our own data and make our own experiments and conclusions. But I think there's people, like for example, what's his first name? Jax, this guy who's working with Forest Garden, like he's done a lot of research with that. He's also done a lot of work with like carbon farming, like looking at kind of perennial crops and how that's like looking up carbon in the soil, and comparing like kind of permaculture based systems with other systems. I think on a small scale, like friends of ours in Bulgaria, for example, they've got like a polyculture project. So they've got like a forest garden mixed with a polycultural market garden, and they're doing a research project, like recording all the energy inputs into that. So it's all designed with permaculture. And then they're like recording kind of the energy and the time inputs into that. They're recording like the different yields they're getting out of it. And they're also recording not just like the things that are beneficial for humans in terms of food, but they're also looking at the benefits to the ecosystem. So they're like observing wildlife, observing different kinds of insects over time, and looking at like, as a bare field, what was the level of life going on? And as a forest garden with polycultural vegetable garden, whatever going on with it, then what's happening? So then they've got like different sheets, they've got like volunteers like monitoring different things all the time. And I thought that was an interesting system that he'd set up, and something that could also be replicated by other people. So kind of looking at different ways of seeing, like how is the kind of the diversity building up, like in the soil, in the insect life, in the plant life, as you put like a permaculture system into action.
And that's interesting that you should say that, because that seems to be taking into account many of the variables which are occurring within a complex system. It's not only dealing with one particular type of yield. So say, for instance, within monocultures, there's a tendency towards homogeneity. There is a sort of trend where yields are only considered effective, they're only considered good if there is a lot of the food that you're intending on producing. Whereas I think one of the stronger points of permaculture, which is sometimes more difficult to measure, is whether or not you can begin to take into account all of the other potential yields that you are gathering or gaining from putting a strong, resilient system in place. So if you were to go out into a forest garden and you were to see that it was a productive space, and if you were to measure the productivity against a monoculture of a similar size, and the monoculture outperformed it in terms of pure yield when it comes to the food produced, that doesn't necessarily mean to say that the forest garden isn't potentially beneficial in other respects as well. And I think that's something that perhaps isn't sometimes taken into consideration. So within some of the critiques that I was reading online, and I could link them to you at another point in time or afterwards, so long as I can find them, I do have a list of the reading that I've been doing on this page here. There were claims that permaculture isn't all that it's cracked up to be. There were claims that it simply isn't productive. But one of the things that kept on coming up is this whole notion of reductionism. Agribusiness is able to deliver food, but the way in which it does it doesn't take into account the necessity for sustainability long term, nor does it take into account the need for biodiversity or soil health and all the rest of it. And I think these are all valid ways, these are all valid yields which ought to be taken into consideration too. I have a few other points. No, but go on, Gray, what were you going to say?
I was just gonna add to that. Just like with the kind of question, and it's brought up a lot in the permaculture community about how we justify ourselves to kind of mainstream science and also to the public. I have concerns over what, like, whether or not we should do that, for the reason that I think science with a kind of big S, the institution of science, really is not worth convincing, because they're not going to be convinced. And the reason is because, like, basically we live, I mean, if science was being used to actually make the best use of our resources to build a society where we, our eating habits, our production habits make sense, from a basic scientific perspective, I mean, we wouldn't be in the society that we're in. I mean, it doesn't take very much research to figure out that the way of, agriculture that most food is produced right now just makes no sense. I mean, it goes back to Rakesh's definition, right, of like common sense is no longer common, right? And I think there's a reason for that. It's because we live in a system that rewards certain behaviors that really don't make any logical sense, and I mean, it goes back to capitalism and other aspects of it. But like, I think that the kind of institution of science has become a way of, it basically just gets money in all of the projects that justify the way that we already do things, and it doesn't get money to fund the research that actually looks at alternatives to that. Because there's loads of science out there, like studying agroforestry and permaculture and things like that, and there's like loads of very conclusive studies to show how much better it would be, but it's just they just get no funding, and they don't get published, they don't get the funding to do it on a large scale, and so they're just like kind of go away basically. But I think what Sophie's doing, like, and her partner, and loads obviously of other people, where they're just experimenting. I mean, that is science with a small s. It's basically just a systematic inquiry into what how things work. And I think that's really, for me, really in line with permaculture. It starts with observing. It starts with actually just coming to terms with the reality of where you are, and then slowly trying to systematically try things that work in tune with all of the different variables that you're looking at, and obviously it goes beyond that as well, and the spirituality aspect and everything doesn't necessarily fit into that. But I think the basic premise of permaculture is pretty in line with science, and I think we should really be focusing on, like, what Sophie and her partner are focusing on, like, how can we reach the people that are in our most immediate area and say, look, this is working. this is going to help you. You know, we're building seed banks, we're building things. You don't need to know. I mean, why do we need to have like huge funded studies to prove to like some big institution that it's working? I mean, who cares? Like, what matters is, are the people around you benefiting from it? Are you helping them? Are they seeing that reward, and do they support you? You know?
I think there most definitely are questions about proof and whether that proof is being directed towards a given set of individuals. Is it being delivered to an authority that you are attempting to prove so that you might gain widespread popularity, or are you attempting to prove a certain set of precepts to the people themselves so that they continue to have some faith within some of the processes which are enacted within permaculture as a movement, some of the techniques which are adopted? One of the other points that you mentioned there is how agribusiness, even though it seems to be supposedly scientifically sound as a discipline, and even though there seems to be many particular methods that are adopted in order to increase yields, that doesn't necessarily mean to say that it's taking into consideration some of the other scientific knowledge that we have, such as the sensitivity of ecosystems and how it is that they can be disrupted. Is it an ecologically inclusive approach? And I would beg to differ in many respects. If you're experiencing soil erosion on a piece of land, which is then going to degrade the continued use of that land, and if you are going to be using a piece of land which could have been habitat for an incredible array of creatures, then is this really sound science? Well, perhaps it may seem to be sound science, but maybe it isn't dealing with some of the ethical questions that we could be investigating. And I think that's perhaps the intersection between science and philosophy, how philosophy needs to perhaps back up science in many respects in order to not prove the efficacy of the approaches that are being developed and which are being employed, but in order to test to see whether or not they are going to be sustainable long term, and if they are truly dealing with the needs of the people and the needs of the wider ecological community. Sorry, I haven't been paying attention to the chat. So did you say that it should be ending, Rakesh?
Yeah, so okay, we should have ended 3 minutes ago, but if we'll
my apologies.
Until, for another couple of minutes, and then we just have 10 minutes at the end to check out.
Yep.
Cool. What I would say around that is that a lot of science is very myopic, meaning it looks just at its own field and it's not holistic. So while, yes, that may be the best way to grow a carrot, but the fact that it's destroying the habitat for so many other animals and insects, and therefore completely, totally depreciates the whole ecosystem, which, you know, deprives human beings and other animals and insects of potentially even being able to live on this planet long term. Okay, great, you've got carrots. Well done. You've got carrots, fantastic, but you've just killed the rest of life. Very smart. So the fact that a lot of science just looks too deeply just at one area without looking at the repercussions of everything else, this is the main problem. And so, yeah, so this is where perhaps, as you put it, philosophy and, you know, yeah, other things need to be interjected into it to kind of give it that more holistic approach. So we've got a minute. Would you like to perhaps just say a closing words, just to kind of conclude this, and then we can
Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you everybody for listening and participating. I didn't know precisely where that was going to go. I did write notes and I did have an initial idea, but perhaps I didn't follow it through as much as I possibly could have. I was going to move on to some other points, but I didn't have time, and inevitably with a subject as large as permaculture and a subject as large as philosophy, there isn't time enough on the earth to deal with everything. But yes, thank you for listening. Hopefully you enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks, Ainsley. That was great.
Very much. So shall I wrap up? Just,
go for it.
Okay, facilitate the end. So great, so wonderful, great to hear from everyone. Thanks everyone who participated. Actually, I'm going to stop the recording on YouTube because this is our stuff now. So for everyone on Facebook and YouTube, goodbye. Have